everybody to the Board of County Commissioners Tuesday meeting for April 21st, 2020. I'm going to start out with a little information, the same that we've done in the last few virtual meetings. So in this virtual format, we do have some housekeeping items to review. To the public watching this meeting, when you registered to watch for this meeting, you were registered in our system as attendees. Attendees are webinar participants who are simply viewers of the meeting, an audience member. Your microphone and your webcam will be automatically muted as attendees. However, there will be a time in the meeting for open public comment. And when that time comes, if you wish to participate in public comment, you can raise your virtual hand to be recognized. You should see a hand icon on the device you are using to watch the meeting. And simply press a hand icon once, and we will then call on you, and our moderator will give you 3 minutes. And when your 3 minutes is up, you'll go back into muted status and the next person will be called. You can then continue to watch the webinar as long as you choose. We will try to get everyone who wishes to participate in public comment an opportunity to speak, but please note that in the event that there are more people wishing to speak than time allots, I might need to limit the number of speakers or limit the amount of time per speaker. And speakers will be selected randomly to participate if that occurs. Today we have a pretty full meeting. We're going to try to avoid Wednesday meetings so that we can keep staff available. We have, looks like Commissioner Sorensen is starting. You'll need to, if you could put yourself on mute, that would be great. Commissioner Sorensen.
I muted him.
There we go. Hopefully he'll be able to join us with full view and regular audio here shortly. So as I was mentioning, we have a full day today, and we're trying to avoid Wednesday meetings so that staff can continue their work that they need to do during the pandemic. And we have 5 pretty intensive weeks of meetings, including many for our budget committee. So we're doing our best to keep agendas pretty succinct and keep the meetings moving so that we can get back to the day-to-day work of the county. We have 2 time certains today, one at 10 a.m. and then the other is our 1:30 p.m. public works items. So with that, I'm going to ask if there are any adjustments to the meeting. Okay, seeing no adjustments, we're going to move to item 2 on our agenda, County Administration, for our COVID-19 update. And I'd like to just take the opportunity here for a moment of silence for all the thousands and thousands of people that have died from this pandemic. Mr. Mokryski, when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. And I think we have Karen Gaffney, our Director of Health and Human Services and Incident Commander for our emergency public health response to COVID-19, and she'll lead us through the update. And I'll fill in any additional information as needed. Karen, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Administrator and Chair Buck and the board. I am going to keep my opening remarks fairly brief so that there's enough time for us to talk about whichever areas are of most interest to you. By way of status report, I will tell you that we are sitting at 48 positive test results for COVID in Lane County right now. We have had at least 2,180 negative test results. Of our 48 people who've tested positive, 21 have now recovered, which is really excellent news. One person is hospitalized, 25 people are recovering at home, and one person has passed. As we talk about that data, clearly I feel blessed that our numbers are as low as they have been. That's not the case for many parts of the country. I do, however, want to pause for just a moment and talk a little bit about what those numbers don't necessarily show on the surface. As we have been able to gather more data and really dig a little bit deeper into that, we have discovered here in Lane County what I know is true in many other parts of the country as well, that we do have particular communities who are overrepresented in that data, and I wanted to make sure that the board knew that as well and had the opportunity. When I'm finished with the update, if you want to ask more questions about how we're addressing this, I'm happy to talk about that. Again, of our 48 people who have tested positive, 10 of those people, or almost 22% of those who've tested positive, identify as Hispanic or Latino in our community. And that is clearly an overrepresentation based on population. And so that's an important priority for us moving forward these next weeks as we work to contain the spread of disease. In addition to the data, I want you to know that testing continues to be a struggle in our community. I do want to appreciate the work of McKinsey-Willamette and the University of Oregon and Peace Health. We do now have some testing that's able to happen here in Lane County, and that is new since we last had an opportunity to report to the board. So I look forward to that continuing to grow in our community, and we still definitely have testing as a gap in our toolbox for being able to really address the spread of disease. In terms of PPE and hospital capacity, I would say the news there is good. We do have sufficient PPE in our community, and as I mentioned, only one of our positive cases is currently hospitalized, so we've been able to avoid serious taxing of our hospital resources to date. In terms of a financial report, as you know, as part of our emergency declaration, the board has authorized the county administrator to spend dollars towards the effort with the hope, of course, that as many of those as possible are reimbursable by federal and state resources. As of last Friday, we have spent $686,281 in costs applied towards that delegated authority, and we've encumbered an additional $689,503. So our total committed to date is $1.3 million, a little over $1.3 million, and we continue to watch that very closely. I want to talk about two other quick things, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. The first is our focus on vulnerable populations, which has been true since the beginning of the epidemic, of really looking at people who are most vulnerable for serious disease and death. And so that in our community means a focus on our elderly population. Long-term care facilities are an important part of our work, and people who are homeless because of the significant chronic conditions for people who are chronically homeless in this community. As you know, we have completed the purchase of the property at 100 River Avenue, and that's been an exciting part of this project. And again, I'm happy to provide as many details as you would like. We closed last week. The Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA and the Oregon Health Authority are really tremendous partners with us and have been on site, not only completed the review, but demolition has started. They've brought contractors in, And truly the speed with which we've been able to accomplish so much so quickly is really due to the Oregon Health Authority's request to have the Army Corps of Engineers assess facilities, stand up teams, and put capable contractors in place ahead of time. So we are excited as that project moves forward to increase our capacity to serve people who cannot go home and are ill and need a place to recover. So that's an exciting piece of our strategy. We also continue to staff our respite centers at the Expo Hall at the Fairgrounds and Willamette in Springfield and Wheeler Pavilion. And as part of our regional strategy, the city of Eugene has opened up small camping areas at the Hilliard Community Center, Amazon, and Peterson Barn in order to try and serve that vulnerable population. I know the last time we were together, there was conversation about appropriate strategies for youth. And I know the board's heard public comment in support of opening a youth shelter. And when we last talked, we talked about how that was a strategy that many in the community were working hard to pursue. And Steve, I know you have an update on that. Do you want to provide that right now?
Sure. Thank you, Karen and Chair and Commissioners. I think as the board knows, we've been actively working on this issue and communicating with nonprofit organizations, advocate groups, and the faith community. The 15th Night Initiative submitted a proposal for a youth shelter. And of course, one of the things that we've been concerned about is making sure that whatever solution for youth homelessness that's deployed also follows the CDC and public health recommendations as it relates to physical distancing and other best practices for public health during a pandemic. So as part of this effort, 15th Night submitted a proposal. The Youth Advisory Council at United Way conducted a survey to understand the immediate needs of youth, particularly related to their health issues. The United Way then worked actively with donors and with private donors, as well as Rotary Club presidents, to enlist support. Last Thursday, United Way was successful in securing a $50,000 financial support from an individual donor, and the Eugene Springfield Rotary Clubs collectively will be contributing an additional $30,000. So approximately $80,000 in private funds from donations have come in to support that. The First United Methodist Church has agreed to host the site, and St. Vincent de Paul is providing 24/7 case management. They've hired a site manager yesterday and plan to meet on site today to ensure appropriate social physical distancing protocols. And it's our understanding that the goal is to start housing youth within the next 24 hours. So this is, we believe, a really positive development in addition to all the work that Lane County and our partners have done to help support unhoused adults, that we have a partnership between nonprofit, private donors, philanthropy, and the faith-based community to support unhoused youth through this pandemic.
Great, thanks, Steve. And then the last piece I want to talk a little bit actually, I think goes with that theme of thinking about us as a larger community and how all of the sectors come together to address the challenges that we face. So this last piece is thinking about what will it take, what will it look like as we reopen things. The governor has produced a framework that she's calling Reopening Oregon, and I know that's a topic on many people's minds about how do we appropriately manage the public health risks of moving forward and bring the economy back online in a way that can limit the spread of disease and make sure that we don't lose all of the ground we've made through our stay-at-home strategies. So I know we'll be talking about this each week during our update, and quite frankly, as we continue to work hard to contain the spread of disease, I think the economic piece will become a larger proportion of our emergency and recovery response. So I'm certain that members of the board have seen the draft framework. I don't know that everyone in the viewing public has had an opportunity to see that. It is available on the governor's website. And while the criteria and plan is not final, I know she's making a number of presentations this week to gather input. We did have an opportunity yesterday to hear from her and walk through some of what she imagines will be the phases that Oregon will go through as part of our recovery to open back up. In particular, I wanted to draw to the board's attention her focus for phase one, which is really, again, the idea is very much to make sure that in Oregon, we're positioned to very quickly detect if the disease increases as we open things up so that we can respond quickly. So as part of that, Oregon and each of our counties will need to demonstrate that we have sufficient PPE and sufficient hospital capacity to be able to respond if the disease count increases. So that's why it's important that we've continued to focus on that in our community. And what the draft guidance suggests that a prerequisite for opening a county in Oregon would include a formal request to the governor, which would be information from hospitals and the supply chain, but also a recommendation letter from the county public health officer and a formal vote from the Board of Commissioners certifying that hospital capacity and PPE for first responders is sufficient. So I wanted to let you know that that will be a coming attraction on your board agenda in the future as we get more clear on specifically what the governor's guidance looks like. And I also wanted to make sure each of the board members and the viewing public knows that we're engaged deeply in conversations with key stakeholders throughout the community about how best to really operationalize bringing the economy back online and bringing people back to work. And so I'm feeling very good about the willingness of all of our sectors in the community to come together around that conversation, bring our best thinking. We regularly are talking with the city managers, and Austin Ramirez on our economic development staff is doing tremendous work bringing key partners together. So I wanted to acknowledge that that is becoming an increased focus for us as well. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the county administrator if you want to give any internal updates, and then we can open it up to the board.
I think we can just open it up to the board, and if you have questions, certainly about operations in the county, I can answer those.
Any questions, Commissioner Sorensen? You're on mute. I'm going to go to Commissioner Farr until we can get Commissioner Sorensen off.
I was muted by the organizer. I was muted
There
by
we
the
go.
organizer. Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to ask really anyone there from the staff about the University of Washington metrics data that is released, I guess, daily. And they have a projection of Oregon going from current 82 deaths to approximately 130 deaths by the middle of May, and then leveling off for the remainder of the pandemic, at least out through August. And I was wondering if those projections are something that we're relying upon or we are aware of in terms of where we are compared to other places in the world, and just like to hear your reaction, because I have been asked by constituents if we relax the the controls, then the University of Washington model shows a big spike in total deaths.
Thank you, Commissioner Sorensen and Chair Buck. I think that's exactly the dilemma that everyone is working their way through, of wanting to make sure as we open things up that we do it carefully and that we are monitoring what the impacts are so that we can contain the spread of disease. I would say the University of Washington data is absolutely one set of data that we look at. I think many of you have watched pretty regularly Dr. Pat Ludke's updates. As our health officer, I turn to him and his expertise. He looks at what's happened in other countries for guidance, and certainly the modeling that's happening by several institutions, including the University of Washington, to really look at our projections. He's consistently anticipated that our peak in Lane County is going to be closer to the beginning of May. And I would say absolutely would agree that if we immediately relaxed all of the restrictions, we would anticipate a huge spike. And so that's why the governor is not recommending that we proceed that way, but instead do a phased approach that has 14 days between each phase so that we can really carefully monitor what the impacts are of the changes and respond appropriately.
And so well, first of all, thank you very much for that response. And secondly, it seemed like from the governor's statements yesterday in the call she had with county commissioners, she was really emphasizing this, data that she wants to see before counties are given authority to relax things. Do you anticipate us doing any relaxing in the next week or two?
Currently, the orders, the stay-at-home orders are all state orders. Those have not been county restrictions. So I would not anticipate, unless the governor is looking at some change in her restrictions, and I haven't heard that that would be coming in the next week or two, I would not see those changes in that time frame.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck, and thank you for the detailed report, Karen, Ms. Gaffney, Karen. You really covered a lot of bases there. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to restrict it to three fairly short ones right now. And one of them is probably more of a comment than a question, directed to you, Mr. Mokrajewski, and Ms. Gaffney. You know, you've been really responsive to my really sometimes pretty intense questions about what are we doing for youth. You know, when I first went to Food for Lane County, I identified youth as vulnerable population regarding the kids who are homeless and not getting access to food. By nature, kids are vulnerable, even though they don't fall into the definition that were provided by the CDC. They're not elderly, and they're not necessarily suffering from a underlying health condition. But the fact that they are kids and alone, or kids and struggling to sleep in a safe and sanitary place tonight, they are vulnerable. And once again, you've been responsive to my questions. You've kept the responses really closely inside of our CDC recommendations. That is to say, we're focusing on vulnerable populations, including elderly and nursing homes. You've not always satisfied the questions of the community. The community questions continue to come pretty hard and heavy and impactful regarding what I've just said exactly, that we consider youth to be vulnerable because they are, so many of them not even old enough to drive a car, you know, so we're leaving them in a situation where they're staying in place, even though we don't necessarily know where that place is that they're staying. So I'm encouraged by the report, Mr. Mokrajewski, that 15th Night and First United Methodist are moving forward with what potentially is a more adequate response to my questions and to the community questions. I'm going to keep a close eye on that. We may hear some conversation during the public comment section at today's meeting, but keeping a very close eye on what's happening with kids, because once again, by definition, homeless kids are vulnerable. Some of them we don't even allow to drive. Many of them we don't allow to vote. And we're hoping that they'll take care of themselves during this pandemic. And you know, you've assured me that if we do have kids who are symptomatic or who are diagnosed as positive, that we will find quarantine places for them. I trust that, and I rely on that. But once again, I'm looking forward to what the response is in the next 24 to 48 hours that you're describing, Mr. Mulcahy, regarding, are we going to find a place for kids to be safe, a place for kids to stay tonight without further impacting the rest of their health. The second is just a question regarding returning to normal. There are questions throughout the community, Mr. Mulcahy, that some of them I've directed to you regarding things that people expect us to do on a regular basis that we simply aren't doing right now. And just one of them is restaurant inspections, but there are other things that people come to rely on the county as being the only source of that particular service. And at some point, in fact, you could respond right now. Let's take inspections of soon to open restaurants, for instance. Now, most sit-down restaurants aren't asking for inspections right now, but other restaurants may be trying to open. The time frame on that, do you know where that fits into the governor's phase recommendation? And do you know about when we can begin to address some of the things that only the county can do?
Yeah, Chair Buck and Commissioner Farr, thank you for the question. This is an issue we've been working actively on, and I met last week with Kachina Inman, who's our acting Health and Human Services Director, while Ms. Gaffney is our Incident Commander, and Brian Johnson, who's also in the Emergency Operations Center, but his normal day job is as our Manager of Environmental Health. We have paused inspections in environmental health, restaurant inspections. In part, there's less demand. There are 20 outstanding businesses that are in a similar process where they need an on-site inspection before opening. So 20 businesses are there. What the reason for the pause is largely twofold: to ensure the health and safety of our employees and the public because of those on-site, the challenges that can be presented with on-site inspections. More importantly, though, we've allocated our environmental health staff to the emergency operations response in the community, focusing on inspecting homeless respite shelters, long-term care facilities, and Karen Gaffney can speak more specifically to any of those things that are really critical. And what we've said is, and frankly, to my knowledge, all of the businesses, at least 19 of the 20 businesses have been really supportive and understanding of that move. There has been one that is really wanting to open and get going, and I've had conversations with representatives of that. It's a franchise cookie business is the one that has really been pushing to open. And so the answer to your question, Commissioner, is we're actively reviewing priorities for that team of staff. And we expect that by next week, and we're developing a reopening strategy. So as we're able to reallocate that staff from the emergency operations work back to restaurant inspections to determine what will the priorities be when they get back. So which, of all the workload there, what are we going to allocate them to do initially? So it's my expectation that within the next week to 2 weeks, we will be back to doing some version of restaurant inspections and prioritize that work accordingly. So it's not ideal. I would just acknowledge that, in some cases we've had to pause some services because we've shifted resources or because of the type of the work we're doing can cause a health and safety concern. It's not ideal, but in my estimation, it's what needs to happen so that we can focus on the priorities of keeping the community healthy and safe, and then get back to reopening as quickly as possible. I will say, also, the fact that our numbers are at, I think Karen said 48 positives today and 1 death. And, those numbers they are going to grow. But this has been a really effective to date community response at keeping our community healthy and safe. That response and that success will aid us in our ability to open more quickly, right? Because we've really flattened the curve there. So we hope that people can remain patient and work with us on all of this difficult challenge.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks for taking an inordinate amount of time on Sunday answering my questions. You're on the job 24/7, and I appreciate that. You were very responsive on Sunday. The last thing I'll mention is that yesterday we had a meeting of our Poverty and Homelessness Board Subcommittee, which is the Subcommittee on Shelter and Navigation. It's more, originally it was the Operation 365 Committee. It's a well-populated committee with the, for instance, the Mayor of Eugene is on the committee, Jacob Fox is on the committee, Cheryl Balthrop from the mission, and other people who are high in the level of policymaking for different organizations. And we are keeping track of ongoing progress. And a couple of questions came from that committee. One of them was actually surrounding our HMIS, our Homelessness Management Information System, which we are really leading, from what I can tell, leading the nation in terms of the development and use of that. And I don't know, Karen, if you or Steve can respond to why is the city of Eugene not using our HMIS to keep track of the people going in and out of the newly opened rec site facilities. We're doing a good job in our facilities, including the event center and the Memorial Hall in Springfield. But the HMIS system is only going to be effective if we continue to use it and all information goes into it. I don't know that you have an answer, Karen, but why aren't they using it?
Chair Buck and Commissioner Farr, I probably don't have as detailed an answer as you would like, and I can certainly follow up on that. What I will tell you is that the city of Eugene is working with Whitebird as their primary service provider in each of those sites, and has really worked hard to stand up outreach teams that didn't exist before. And so my guess is there's a piece of it that is part of moving quickly. And so perhaps we can go back and capture some of that. I don't believe that there's an opinion that that data isn't valuable. I do know that as part of this effort, we've been working with the city to establish mobile data gathering systems that I think will be a great model for us moving forward. As you know, one of the TAC report recommendations is to increase mobile outreach. And so that will be a piece of what we need to do. And clearly we need all of that data to come together, and we will find a way to make that work. There's been some great innovation using cell phones that do give us data about the outreach efforts and the camps where that outreach work is happening, producing heat maps for us each week and really giving us some great data to guide this. So I think we just need to figure out how to integrate that so that we also have that data in HMIS.
Thank you, and I'm confident that we're moving in that direction. Once again, the HMIS system that we have is state-of-the-art, and it really does contain all of the data we need for not keeping track of what's happening, but for future planning also. Laura Ashworth gave a good presentation yesterday to the committee on the City of Eugene's outreach, and it's more or less it's using as you mentioned, the using cell phones and other data to map the hotspots, not getting into detail as to who they are or why they're there or where they were before, the way our HMIS system would like. The other thing I will mention is that Amanda Borta and Lisa Stewart were stellar in their presentations yesterday. The meeting went for quite some time. It was a good meeting, but they gave us an example of a day in the life of one of the occupants of the respite centers that we've established, which are at the Memorial Hall in Springfield and at our event center. And really, it was a good representation of what the people do during the day and how do we make certain that their needs are met. I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm satisfied that your staff, Karen, has been most responsive and is doing a superb job of making people as comfortable as possible in what is a very uncomfortable situation. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say we want to leave a little time for some questions, but let's move through this so that we can get to our public comments. So Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. Karen, there's been studies using serological testing for antibodies like Stanford in the Netherlands and another in Germany that are showing far higher rates of exposure than originally thought. which kind of changes the thinking on what the actual mortality and hospitalization rate for COVID-19 is. Is that being taken into account at all in this discussion about reopening?
Chair Buck, Commissioner Bozovich, that's a great question. And what's interesting to me, again, just as a reminder for everyone who's watching, this virus didn't exist on the planet until a few months ago. So we continue to learn so much with each passing week as we get more data. One of the interesting things about the results of the serological test, so I guess just to answer your question, yes, that's being taken into account. And I think we continue to learn more. For instance, I know there's a new debate about whether people get immunity or not and how long that will last and how do we figure that into our projections as we move forward too. So I think there are still a lot of unknown aspects to all of this, which is a piece, I guess I would say, that supports two of the priorities for Dr. Ludke moving forward. One is to make sure that we do everything we can to increase our testing resources here locally so that we're able to quickly determine who is ill and be able to respond to that. And then the second piece is to really stay on top of the science. And I know we're regularly meeting with our state epidemiologists and the health officers and others across the country who are really looking at exactly those confounding factors to figure out what's our best way moving forward.
Thank you. So one other question that I'll get the rest maybe later, but Lane County is not homogeneous. We have definitive metro area in Eugene Springfield, and the largest part of the county is very rural. We're seeing, 46 out of our 48 cases are in Eugene Springfield, and we're seeing really low infection and case counts on the coast. In Coos County, the only two they've had have been at a correctional facility of transferred in inmates. Is there any thought to this issue of having the entire board vote? And I hate the fact they're asking us to certify what a hospital professional should be certifying. Is there any thought that we can have not the entire county open up, that we can allow some of our rural areas more freedom because they're low population densities and low infection rates? It just seems like trying to treat Lane County as peanut butter one is sort of a disproportionate treatment of a very different sort of look. Oak Ridge is not Eugene Springfield, neither is Florence.
Chair Buck and Commissioner Bozovich, that's an interesting question. I know the governor has certainly talked about the possibility of having different regions in Oregon move at a different pace. I hadn't really thought about within the county thinking about there being different regions. I did want to be clear that in terms of your question about having hospitals certify, we absolutely will get information from the hospitals for you before you need to make any decisions. So that makes perfect sense that yes, you should be basing your decision on what you hear from our local hospitals and healthcare providers. And I guess the other piece I would say is that you're absolutely correct that the vast majority of our cases have been in the Eugene Springfield metro area where, frankly, most of our population is as well. And we are not experiencing hospital capacity issues or PPE concerns anywhere in the county right now.
Thank you.
Commissioner Burney?
Thank you. I'd like to make a couple of comments about this place we find ourselves in and then a question. When I grew up, there was a president named Harry Truman. Well, he was before I grew up, but the phrase that was associated with him was "the buck stops here." And I think what we are experiencing is the buck isn't stopping at the highest level, it is stopping at the lowest levels. The buck is stopping here where we are. And so Karen and Steve, I want to commend you on with scarce resources, constantly prioritizing, reassessing, reprioritizing, diverting resources as best we can. One comment number one is that I think that people don't realize the significance of our restaurant industry. And I think it is nuts for either the federal or the state government not to pay restaurants on the ground to keep them open, to provide meals for the hungry and homeless and vulnerable in all communities, but especially in ours. If we don't do that, that suggests we don't leverage existing infrastructure. We let it dwindle. The longer this lasts, the more likely more and more and more of those businesses will not come back online. And I just wanted to make that point. I wanted to make another point, and that is we are getting interesting insights about how our economy works. There is no way in my comprehension I can understand why now on multiple days we've received unbelievably high nationally unemployment numbers associated with a Dow that goes up. I think we need to question how profit-taking or looks at the future of our economy becomes more confident at the same time we're having millions upon millions of millions of people filing unemployment. Those are my statements. I do want to say that I just don't get all the data on testing ultimately is meaningless. It seems to me it gives us patterns and trends and obviously interventions when people are hurting. But I now want to refer to the Harvard Global Health Institute and other research reports that have been brought to my attention that basically all end up saying until we get about 150, 152 tests every day per 100,000 in population, we really won't get over that curve to have a real assessment of where we are and how many people have this and how many people are carrying and can transmit it, whether they get symptoms or not. For Lane County, my rough math says that would be about 500 tests per day. Karen, where are we per day on testing? And do you agree with that statement? Because I'm imagining that creates a significant delta between where we are and where we need to be to open up our economy statewide and nationally. And I might say, listen, I'm climbing the walls like anybody else. I want to get the hell out of my house. I want to get out and do things. And you know, my wife promised to marry me for better or for worse, but not for lunch. And you know, we're all having those issues. So what is the delta in Lane County between how many tests we're doing a day and the 500 a day that, according to researchers, would really allow us to open the economy safely, prudently, and sanely?
Chair Buck, Commissioner Burney, thanks for that narrow question in terms of numbers of tests. And I'm excited about the possibility of getting to 500. I will tell you, I mentioned quickly in my opening remarks that McKinsey-Willamette and Peace Health are both now doing some testing here locally.
Very aware.
And I'm not sure what Peace Health's current numbers are. I know last week when I checked in, they were at about 100 a day and hoping to increase that. When McKinsey-Willamette and U of O opened their collaboration, we were able to run some tests over the weekend, which was fantastic for public health. And then they opened yesterday for open hours to be able to do testing. And again, their hope is actually to get to 500 tests a day. What is holding them back at this point is a piece of equipment that they're waiting for. They're actually, as it's been explained to me, and I'm not a lab girl, so I only have a little bit of knowledge on this, but they're having to do manual RNA extraction that is taking obviously more time than if they had the additional equipment that they needed, and then making sure that we have enough swabs in the community to be able to meet that 500 tests a day. So that's their goal, is to get to that, and certainly to increase their capacity over the next several weeks. So I am hopeful that we will be able to get to 500 tests a day in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you, Karen, and let me just share how huge that is, because right now the average statewide is 30 tests per day per 100,000 population. So for Lane County to be able to achieve that will be significant. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I'll just add a couple statements, which is I think our supply chain for testing has been basically a national embarrassment at this point. We should have been doing testing at a high level from the very beginning, and disappointed in how that has manifested to our local communities. And we can only work as hard as we can to get more testing going. I am happy to see that we will be increasing that, because that is going to be one of the benchmarks that we have to have in order to get our economy and people back out into our new normal. So with that, I'll move to item number 3, emergency business. Is there any emergency business? It doesn't look like it. So let's move on to public comment. And I'm going to transfer this to our moderator. And we have scheduled about 15 minutes before a time certain, but we really want to hear from people, especially since we don't have our evening public comment session that we typically would have this evening. Diana.
Hello, everybody. Give me 1 minute. At this time, we will open up the board meeting for public comment. If you would like to participate in public comment, please raise your hand, your virtual hand at this time, so I can see who all would like to speak. I will start with Adam Bradell. Mr. Bradell, I will go ahead and start the timer and unmute you, and your 3 minutes will begin. 1 moment. Sorry, my phone is taking a second to respond. Just a sec. Mr. Bradell, you are unmuted.
Good morning. My thanks to commissioners and staff for the hard work of this season. I serve at the First United Methodist Church of Eugene, affectionately known by many as the Toaster Church, and we serve as the Egan Hypothermia shelter for youth during the cold weather season. We are so grateful for the work of 15th Night to raise private support to provide some care for our community's homeless youth during the pandemic. I have not yet seen that the $30,000 from the United Rotary Board is confirmed, but please do keep that contribution on your heart and in your prayers. The plan we are implementing has been prepared by the organizations you trust, organizations like Looking Glass and 15th Night, as well as the McKinney-Vento staff of the various school districts. We would happily work with your team to make it a better plan, a plan that would qualify for FEMA reimbursement. The plan has always been envisioned to be a public-private partnership in funding and in operations. This is a season where so many of our faith communities are incredibly financially vulnerable, especially perhaps in our rural areas. And this would be an awful time for the county to abrogate its responsibility to help with these efforts and instead expect the faith community and other community-based organizations to shoulder this burden alone. We know that we have more than 400 homeless youth across the Bethel, Springfield, 4J school districts alone, and we've made data available to you and your team that documents how these children are uniquely high risk during the pandemic. We need your support. We've needed it for the past 6 weeks, and we stand ready still to work with your team to make that happen. But thank you for your service, and your teams remain in our prayers.
Thank you, Mr. Bradell. At this time, I do not show that anyone else who has registered for the meeting has raised their hand for public comment. If you would like to give public comment, I do see a few people registered, but no one raising their hand. So if you would like to speak at public comment, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, this will conclude our public comment portion. I'll give you a couple more opportunities. I do not see anybody else raising their hand, so Chair Buck, I believe we have concluded public comment at this time.
Very good. Any commissioners' remonstrance or comments? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Reverend Burdell. You've been in constant contact with at least me and I think probably other commissioners, and thank you for continuing to work toward providing a safe place for our homeless kids to sleep tonight. You say that we are in your prayers. Thank you for that.
Any other comment? Commissioner Sorensen.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Reverend Burdell, for your comment today at the Board of Commissioners meeting. I especially appreciate your advocacy for homeless kids in our community. And I was wondering, Mr. Administrator, if you could outline what efforts are being made to collaborate with Reverend Burdell and his organization, and whether or not the collaboration has ended or if it's continuing, and what the status of that is. I heard you say earlier that the 15th Night program was going ahead. What about the proposal that Reverend Burdell and his group are making?
Chair and Commissioner Sorensen, yeah, they're actually the same proposal as I understand it. So 15th Night and the First Methodist Church work together on that proposal, as I understand it. United Way was engaged and donors were identified, and I mentioned the $50,000 donation from an individual donor to United Way, and then $30,000 that was confirmed to me yesterday by the CEO of United Way. And so there's $80,000 that has been raised for that work. One of the challenges that we've had with funding of that proposal, which is why I think it's really great that private donors have stepped up to assist with that funding, is that based on the way that the proposal is structured, and Ms. Gaffney could speak more specifically to this, based on the way that the proposed solution is to be implemented, it does not qualify. We do not believe it would qualify for FEMA reimbursement, whereas the other initiatives that the county has spearheaded, including 2 homeless respite sites, one in Eugene, one in Springfield, converting the existing Dusk to Dawn to a Dawn to Dawn program. You heard Ms. Gaffney talk about the $600,000+ in contracts that we have currently executed, the purchase of the VA, the former VA clinic, all of those things that Lane County has led. Portions of that are reimbursable by FEMA, up to 75%. So the county is still responsible for a 25% match for that. In the case of this proposal, we did not believe that the way that it was structured in the CDC requirements and FEMA regulations would have allowed for reimbursement. So again, that's why the private funding is really critical. We continue to coordinate and will gladly coordinate with this group. It's why I was on the call yesterday with United Way to talk about where we were at. I serve on the United Way board, as you all know. And Ms. Gaffney has been actively coordinating with the 15th Night and Reverend Burdell. And we will continue to do that to make sure that their proposal meets all of our public health guidelines and support that important work. And then the longer term, I'll just make a brief comment about the longer term solution for or shelter work for youth homelessness. We've been actively working and identified a site out at our MLK campus to retrofit a facility for up to a 16-bed youth homeless shelter in the future. So we're very much committed both in our work and our resources to fund the ongoing pathways to end homelessness, both in the youth and the adult communities.
I believe we have one other person that was interested in commenting, and so let's move back to that real quick, Diana.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Actually, two people have now raised their hands, so we'll move back to them. I first show Tina Patel, who has raised her hand. It looks like you just joined the meeting. I will start the timer and then unmute you. One moment. Ms. Patel, you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you, commissioners and chair people. I'd like to, on behalf of Alco Hotels, I am strongly urging you to against Ordinance 20-03, which was proposed on the 16th of 2020 in April. The ordinance proposed is to amend Lane County Chapter 9 to require Lane County lodgers to accept government vouchers and payments during an emergency. The Board of Health is requesting that Lane Code Chapter 9 be revised to establish that no proprietary of the businesses providing transient lodging may refuse to accept government payment of a reasonable rate for transient lodging. I'm urging you to please reconsider and work with hoteliers directly, because our staff is not trained to deal with the vulnerable population. They're not trained to deal with COVID positive patients or potential positive patients. And we're seeing a lot of backlash from our employees saying that this is not what they were hired on for. This is not what they feel safe doing. In addition to just the logistical safety precautions that we would have to take for our housekeeping with our linens. This is not something that hoteliers should be forced to do. It should be a contract that is made and with reasonable terms on both sides. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Our next presenter will be Mr. McFadden. Give me one moment to reset the timer and I will unmute your microphone, Mr. McFadden.
Commissioner Sorensen, you might need to mute your microphone so we don't have the background noise.
Mr. McFadden, I am unmuting your microphone.
All right,
Mr.
hello,
McFadden,
good morning. Yeah, I heard that little F-bomb. Any rate, so yeah, I really wanted to commend and support the focus and attention that's being paid to the issue of youth, vulnerable youth, unhoused youth. And there's just a ton of facets to, this issue. And as someone who, spent time as a aged out foster youth unhoused on the streets of Springfield and Eugene, I really want to, underscore the urgency that this, matter needs. Over the past years, you've probably heard your public health experts talking about adverse childhood experiences, and while the psychological trauma from all sorts of situations that vulnerable youth find themselves in is hard enough, there are and there's scientific proof of lingering physical health effects long into the adulthoods of the people who have adverse childhood experiences. And so in a slow motion way, when there are events such as this pandemic, there are effects that will reverberate long into the future. And it's really just critical and important to address as much of that upstream as is possible. And so, I just really want to underscore that besides unhoused youth, there are also all sorts of other youth in vulnerable situations, perhaps youth who now finding themselves unable to go to schools or public libraries, and find themselves, in domestic situations with abusers and in abusive situations. There's just been a huge increase in reports of that kind of thing during this crisis. And I know that there's just a lot of concern about domestic violence in family units. So I really want to underscore the vulnerability of youth in the community, especially ones who are unhoused, but youth, as Commissioner Farr said, in general, are vulnerable by their very nature. And last but not least, I want to shout out to all the public and just really beg their support of the foster families and foster kids in Lane County right now who really need the entire community to step up and provide them support. So thank you for your time and attention. Have a good day.
Thank you
Mr.
very
McFadden.
much for those 2 additional public comments. Due to our time constraints for today, I'm going to move on and entertain a motion for approval of our consent calendar.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Burney, second by Commissioner Bozievich. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll move on to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. So we are now down to our 10 a.m. time certain under Public Works, which is a discussion in the matter of presenting the draft FY19 Lane County Internal Operations Greenhouse Gas Inventory. It's a very timely conversation given that Earth Day is tomorrow. So with us is Mr. Hurley, Director of our Public Works.
Great. Thank you, Chair Buck. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm joined today by Mark Nystrom. He's our recently hired climate strategist for the county, and Aaron Tonys. He's with Good Company, and he did the work preparing our greenhouse gas inventory that we're going to share with you today. And Commissioner Buck already mentioned that, yes, tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, so I think it's fitting that today we bring our first deliverable since the board took action with the climate resolution. So this is our first greenhouse gas inventory, and I want to emphasize that this is an inventory for county operations. It's not an inventory for all of Lane County. We'll get to that in phase 2 of our climate action plan. But this is an inventory for fiscal year 2019 that we have the most recent data for. So as you're aware, climate change is a huge issue, a global issue, and there's no silver bullet to fix it. But we all need to do our own part and do what we can as individuals and organizations. So with that, we felt that we needed to do a greenhouse gas inventory to find out where we should start, to get our internal house in order and use that assessment to point where we should focus our efforts. And with that, I don't want to take up Aaron's time. Aaron's done probably dozens of these greenhouse inventories across the state and nationally. And we're happy to have him here to present the data from our inventory. Aaron?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
We're all nodding
Diana,
our head. Yes, if you can't see us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. It's an honor to be here presenting the first ever inventory. My presentation today will go about 20 minutes. I'm going to lead with a little greenhouse gas inventory 101 information to provide a foundation for everybody as we get into the results. I'll cover the results in agency-wide as well as for specific functional areas within the agency. These two will make up the bulk of my presentation. Towards the end, we'll cover some next steps towards climate action planning. I'll hand it back to Dan and Mark for that part, and then happy to answer any of your questions related to the inventory. As I get going, I do want to call out the significant work done by County staff member Angie Marzano and my colleague Claudia Denton at Good Company. They did a lot of the work on this inventory, and I just want to say thanks to both of them for that. All right, so to get into the Greenhouse Gas Inventory 101 information, the inventories are based on protocols. These are written documents that describe the rules on how to conduct an inventory. You can think of it as the tax code for greenhouse gas reporting. They define what data to collect and how to calculate emissions from that data. The protocol we use for Lane County's inventory is called the Local Government Operations Protocol. It's been around about 10 years. It's tried and true. There are some other protocols and guidance documents we use to supplement that. They're newer. They provide more detailed guidance. You can see them here. To calculate emissions, we use Good Company's Carbon Calculator. It is built on this protocol. It's an Excel-based spreadsheet. It was used to calculate emissions for fiscal year 19, but it is also set up to allow the county to track your emissions over time and track progress. At the very simplest, what is a greenhouse gas inventory and what is being measured? In an inventory, we're measuring the weight of different greenhouse gases defined in the protocol, and we are converting them all into a common unit, which is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The way that works is we take the weight and we multiply it by a global warming potential. So they are all set relative to carbon dioxide. So if you take 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, you multiply it by 1 to get 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. But if you have 1 metric ton of methane, you'd multiply it by 28, and you get 28 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. You've probably heard folks talk about powerful greenhouse gases. This is what they mean. Different gases have different impacts towards climate change. The 4 gases you see in this table are the most common to government operational inventories. Carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are all the products of fossil fuel combustion. Methane and nitrous oxide are also products of waste treatment, solid waste at landfills, and also wastewater. Hydrofluorocarbons are refrigerants. So part of an inventory is capturing refrigerants lost from building systems or vehicle systems. You can see that there's a range of global warming potentials for refrigerants between 12 and 12,000. There's different types of refrigerants. Each of them has a different GWP. The 4 gases you see here are most common to operational inventories. There's actually 7, but the other 3 are industry specific and not applicable to the county. What is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent? It's probably not something you think about very often. But it can be thought of as equal to any one of these bullet points. It could be driving your car about 2,500 miles. It's about 10% of one home's energy use for a year. If you're into barbecuing, it's 40 propane cylinders. Or it is the amount of carbon sequestered in a year's time by about 1.2 acres of U.S. forest. If you're interested in what it looks like in terms of volume, these are all invisible gases, but they do have a volume, and it's about the size of a single family home. In greenhouse gas accounting, we think about emissions in different categories. They are called scopes. There are 3 of them. This graphic shows them. You see the greenhouse gases up there on top. Scope 1 emissions are those owned and controlled by Lane County or any organization that's doing an inventory. These often include, for most, natural gas combustion by buildings or vehicle fuel combustion. In Lane County's inventory, Scope 1 emissions also include emissions from Short Mountain landfill. Scope 2 emissions are indirect, whereas Scope 1 are direct. Scope 1 are tailpipe and direct emissions from your owned and operated equipment and facilities. Scope 2 are indirect from purchased electricity from the grid. Scope 1 and 2 together are important in that they oftentimes are the basis for organizational climate goals. Scope 3 emissions are all other sources of mission critical emissions, both upstream and downstream of your operations. You'll see in the results I show in a minute, an example of this is employee commute. These are in Scope 3 because they are shared with your employees. It is mission critical that those employees come to the facilities every day. But they're Scope 3 because obviously Lane County doesn't have direct control over how those employees make that commute, or what kind of vehicle is being used, the efficiency, or the fuel type. So while the mission critical, they aren't under the direct control of Lane County. I'll be presenting results in these 3 scopes in a moment here. Before I get into results, I just want to lay out the functional areas we looked at in the inventory. There are 5 of them. So we split Lane County operations into 5 different groupings. They include administration and all others, health and human services, public works, sheriff's office, and the waste management division. The colors you see here will carry over into the graphic so you can see relative contributions by the different functional areas. All right, now we get into the results. This graphic shows the highest level results from the inventory. On the y-axis, you're seeing those metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And on the x-axis, we have different sources of emissions included in Lane County's inventory by different scope categories. As you can see, the overwhelming takeaway on this graphic is the large green bar, and that is Short Mountain Landfill, the fugitive methane from Short Mountain Landfill. It is included as a Scope 1 emission source for Lane County because you have operational control over it. After this point, I'm going to show a bunch more graphics, but I'm going to take out the Short Mountain Landfill so we can see other sources of emissions more clearly. Certainly don't want anybody to lose track that Short Mountain is the biggest source of emissions, but I want to make sure that other sources are highlighted as well. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to show the same graphic for Scopes 1 and 2 with Short Mountain removed. So as you can see, largest source of Scope 1 emissions are from owned vehicles and equipment, and the fuels combusted by those, followed by building use of natural gas. And then we have landfill emissions from operations. So these are also Short Mountain Landfill emissions, but only for waste generated in the course of county operations. So the waste from your dumpsters going to Short Mountain Landfill, and not the rest of the community's waste to Short Mountain Landfill. And then we have electricity. Electricity in our community is small because we are fortunate to be supplied by low impact electricity resources, hydro, wind, nuclear, all very low greenhouse gas intensive resources. So electricity is relatively small in our area. Again, Scope 1 and 2, commonly sources of emissions included in climate goals. We'll add in Scope 3 here, those shared sources of emissions with others. They include upstream production of the energy, so it takes energy and emissions to produce the fuels that are combusted and shown in Scopes 1 and 2. So this is the upstream emissions for production of those fuels. Next, we have employee commute, and the large bar to the far right there is supply chain. So supply chain captures all of the goods and services purchased by Lane County. Again, these emissions aren't under the direct control of Lane County. They are by your vendors. But what these emissions are showing are the emissions associated with production of the goods and services purchased by Lane County. And while they aren't under the direct control, there are opportunities to reduce emissions in supply chain as our other Scope 3 sources, which is why they're included in the inventory.
Chair Buck, I have a very pertinent question at this point, if I may.
Of course, please.
I'm sorry, I will not interrupt, but I don't see any place on any of the graphs for our liquid waste, our wastewater and treatment of wastewater, which we do have some direct control of, but it certainly is inside of our purview.
Can you say a little bit more about that wastewater?
Well, we have the Metropolitan Wastewater Management, Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant has a great deal of methane production that we're in the process of trying to capture. And while it's not directly the purview of Lane County, it certainly is a part of our overall greenhouse gas emission picture. If it's not included in this, the commission itself is working on that, but it does need to be at least overlaid onto our picture of greenhouse gas emission.
Fair enough. The production of wastewater and the emissions associated with the treatment of that water from Lane County operations were not included in this round of the inventory. They would be included as Scope 3. I can say, though, that MWMC's emissions are inventoried by them and their staff. So certainly information is available for that, though the fraction allocated to Lane County operations was not included in this inventory. It certainly could be in the future. I imagine it would be relatively small, but it wasn't included this time around.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for slowing the process.
No, please. I prefer a discussion rather than talking for too long. Thank you for asking. All right, so sorry, I'm going to gather my thoughts again. So we were talking supply chain. So now I'd like to show you all a couple more layers of detail for Scope 1 and 2 sources, because they are closest to your control. So let's just, I'm just going to expand Scope 1 and 2 sources here, so you can see the contribution from different functional areas. Same results we showed on the last slide, just a zoomed in version. So you can see owned vehicles, and that the contributions to that are coming from Public Works and from Waste Management and from the Sheriff's Office predominantly. For natural gas, we see that is also from Public Works and Administration and all others. And then the smaller sources, you can see the various contributions there. To this point in the presentation, I've been talking in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I'd like to switch for just a moment to show you some trends, some historic trends in energy use associated with these. And for these, I'm going to be talking in the units of activity we captured for the inventory. So the first one I want to show is for vehicle fuel use. This time on the y-axis, it's gallons of fuel use versus greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see we were able to collect data for 2 points in time. We weren't able to do this for the whole of the inventory, but sometimes if you do an inventory for a single year, it can be a little bit unsatisfying because you can't see how things are moving year over year. So we oftentimes try to capture at least some portion of history so you can see those trends. Again, this one is for vehicle fuel for 2 points in time. The darker part, the black part of this graphic is showing fossil fuel use, and the green part is showing non-fossil fuel products, so renewable diesel, biodiesel, and ethanol. So what this shows is that over time, total fuel use has been increasing, but at the same time, the proportion of non-fossil fuel products is also increasing. And so while the use of fuels is going up, the greenhouse gas emissions from those is going down because fossil fuel use is being reduced via those purchases. Let's switch over to natural gas. This time the y-axis is in therms of natural gas for the same 2 points in time. Again, you can see here trend is declining. So use of natural gas has gone down over this time period. Some of this can be explained by a warmer winter in fiscal year 19 compared to fiscal year 14, but it doesn't explain all of it. So it seems that there is some efficiency gains in here as well. Finally, we have electricity use, which is in kilowatt hours for the same 2 points in time. And again, we see a decline here in overall energy use. Coming back to this graphic for a moment, I do want to focus in on supply chain because it is such a large bar here and show you a little bit of the details. There's much more in the report than I'll show you today, but I do want to show some details on this. So the two donut graphics here, the one on the right is the same as the bar you just saw. It's showing contributions from the different functional areas that we looked at in the inventory. So you can see Public Works and Health and Human Services are the largest. And then the graphic on the right shows different purchasing types, different purchasing categories, and the impacts of those. And the largest is on the bottom there in blue. You can see it is construction and maintenance of buildings, roads, other infrastructure. This is common in all the inventories we do that include supply chain for government operations. Without a doubt, most of the time, construction and maintenance is the largest for government operations. For you all, it is followed by vehicles and equipment. So this is the production of those vehicles and equipment, not the burning of fuel in them, just the production of them, of the actual car or the actual piece of equipment. Then we have community-directed services. These are the services provided by the county to those most vulnerable in our community to provide healthcare and all other critical needs for those vulnerable and in need. Business services is certainly me as a professional service provider, lawyers, accountants, other various forms of business services that serve the county. Then we have IT equipment and service, office supplies and printing, and a smaller fraction for business travel, mostly air travel by county employees. So Mark or Dan, the next slide, I'll be handing it back over to you. But before I do, I do just want to sort of summarize the hot spots in the county's inventory. Certainly Short Mountain Landfill is far and away the largest source of county emissions, followed by vehicle fuel use, and Public Works and Waste Management and the Sheriff's Office. And then we have natural gas use in buildings by Public Works and Administration and others, and then supply chain, Public Works and Health and Human Services. And so this wraps up the inventory part. We're gonna have one slide here on the larger project next steps, and I'll hand it over to Dan and Mark here, but I'll be back in a moment to answer any other questions you have about the inventory. Dan and Mark?
So this is Mark. Hopefully you can all hear me. So we've already met with our functional area groups, so fleet, facility, waste management, and purchasing, to just try to get from staff what some of their ideas might be. We don't want to go in there and tell them what to do. So they've been given some homework to come back with some ideas from each of their functional areas on how to best explain that. That homework is due May 1st. And I'm planning on summarizing that and handing it off to Good Company. And Good Company will then be working on a draft internal operations climate action plan. And they hope to have that done by June. And we've scheduled time with you all on July 21st to provide an internal operations climate action plan to you. So you'll be able to get a good look at that in July. So I'm available for any questions about next steps. Aaron's available for any questions about the inventory itself. And I know Dan has a couple of statements he would like to make as well.
Great, thanks Mark, and thanks Aaron. So for me, the two biggest takeaways from this presentation are, one, that Our fossil fuel use and electricity are already showing a downward trend, so that's great to see. The second one is that the landfill accounts for the vast majority of our emissions at 81%. And this validated some of our assumptions, but it's great to see this data to quantify our results. And with the landfill accounting for most of the emissions, I think that's where we should be putting our focus. And I want to say that Waste Management's doing great things. We have the highest recovery rate in the state. We just got our most recent results at 53.8%, our recovery rate. And that EPUD, that runs the gas collection system out of the landfill, is doing a great job. They're running that as efficiently as they can. But due to the high global warming potential of methane and the inherent inefficiency of a system like that, which is only able to capture about 75% of the emissions, just the way that those systems are structured. That's why we have such an impact from the landfill. And so to address that, we're going to need to take some bold action to look at managing the organics differently that are coming into our waste system. So we talked about this before in the process of our solid waste master plan, that we should be looking at getting those organics into some sort of anaerobic digestion to be able to capture those more efficiently and create energy. So with the solid waste master plan, the board endorsed that and the recommendations in that to begin exploring that, to look at forming a joint powers association authority with the cities to possibly manage our waste in a different way. So with the board's support, we will continue to move in that direction. I also want to say that we'll be back on May 15th to start talking about greenhouse gas reduction goals. And again, as Mark mentioned, we'll be returning in July to bring the draft climate action plan for our phase 1 project. And with that, I'll turn it over back to Chair Buck for discussion with the board. Thanks.
Any questions or comments from the board? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. I'll be brief. This is a fascinating presentation. Thank you. The data is going to take a while to really assimilate. I'm going to go back to wastewater treatment, however. While the Short Mountain landfill produces a great amount of methane, and we do operate the landfill, the waste, as you mentioned, Dan, does come from inside the cities as well as outside the cities. Same thing with the wastewater. So I think not to encumber this particular study with the work that's going on with wastewater, we should continue to keep an eye on it. We are a third of the Wastewater Management Commission. It's Lane County, City of Eugene, City of Springfield, and we share in the management of wastewater. So it is really a part of our general operation, even though we don't put a great deal of staff time into it. It's predominantly done by the City of Eugene, City of Springfield. Most of the wastewater comes from inside of those two cities, but not all of it. But it is, once again, it is a high methane producer. And if we're not keeping track at some level on what is happening with the methane that is being captured through the treatment process, then we're kind of missing out on, I think, a large part of the ultimate equation. So once again, not to belabor this particular study, but it is something we need to keep an eye on. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for all this great work. Really appreciate the energy being put into this. With regard to the next steps component of this, do you believe that we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, increase them, or otherwise make any changes? And if so, how would we do that?
So this is Dan. Definitely we all need to be reducing our emissions. We'll be returning for a discussion on that next month to talk about how quickly and how much the board would like to target those reductions.
And do you have any ideas currently on what, and to give us some insight in the community, some insight into some ideas that you have for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and how would we do that? What would be the tangible steps we would take to do that?
So we'll have several ideas when we come back to you from different sectors. We'll be looking at purchasing, we'll be looking at the landfill operation, we'll be looking at fleet. Some examples are electrifying our fleet, moving more of our vehicles to electric power. But the big one, as I mentioned before, is the landfill. If we can get those organics that are currently decomposing in the landfill and producing methane, if we can get those into a contained facility to, it's called an anaerobic digester, to capture that gas and then produce more energy from that, that would be one of the big actions that we could take.
You think we're going to get a contract with LTD or with Northwest Natural to capture some of that and use some of that greenhouse gas?
I think there's potential there for sure. Northwest Natural wants to reduce the amount of fossil fuel in their portfolio and switch to biogas. So I think there's potential funding out there for projects like that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Bozievich and then Commissioner Burney.
Thank you. I just want to note, those two graphs about the electric and natural gas usage over time. I want to put a little perspective on that. Those 5-year periods cover a massive expansion of a lot of our staff and facilities relative to Health and Human Services and adding new clinics and facilities. It also includes a period where we increased the amount of road construction and construction work that the county was doing after the passage of House Bill 2017. So despite all that expansion that was going on, that's part of the graph that doesn't show, we still managed a reduction in gas and electric usage without having a climate action plan. 4 out of those 5 years were when the board majority was conservative, and we still did it without having to virtue signal over the questionable science of anthropogenic climate change. We did it because conservatives believe in conserving and saving taxpayer dollars, and it just makes sense. And it's just a natural byproduct of that we reduced our energy and gas usage, and we've actually lowered those. Also, just like to place into proportion our landfill methane generation. Wetlands, naturally occurring wetlands across the world generate over 167 million metric tons of methane annually. And we've lost a significant portion of wetlands over the last several hundred years as we developed as mankind. So we've lost that methane generating capacity, and we've somewhat converted it over to landfills. So panicking over our landfill is something we shouldn't be doing, but we have done a lot to improve the landfill. And I think one of the things we did is a major change in the operations of the landfill and how large of an open face we're keeping open. We brought some staff from another facility that taught us a way to actually keep less of an open face there. It's also limited the amount of liquors we have to move out of that landfill because we get less liquid into it. So we've done a lot to improve our operations over time. I do have one quick question for you folks. We kind of talk about the operational footprint, greenhouse gas generation for vehicles, and then we also have a separate category for purchasing that the vehicles go into. But nowhere does it quite give the balance of, yes, we gain something on the operational side with e-vehicles, but are we actually losing something on the purchasing side in the upstream and downstream of how much more it takes to build these e-vehicles, and particularly some of the vehicles that are the hybrids? Can you answer that question a little bit for me? Because I think sometimes we look at e-vehicles as kind of a savior, but we don't think about the upstream, downstream cost of e-vehicles.
Yes.
Sure, I don't have data on that. Aaron,
yeah,
Aaron, do you have data on?
I can comment a bit, sure. So everything I've seen in the literature, Commissioner, says that while it is true that the production of electric vehicles and hybrid are slightly higher than the production of internal combustion vehicles. In terms of those production emissions, in our electricity grid region, that initial investment in slightly more emissions is much. There is much greater benefit in moving to electricity versus gasoline fuels from those vehicles. So there's larger production emissions. You're right, but over the life cycle of those vehicles, it will result in a net decrease. Everything I've seen in the literature on that so far.
What about the downstream and disposal of some of the more toxic chemicals that are now in the battery systems?
There is no doubt that systems will need to be created. And something I didn't mention about my own bio is that I used to actually work as an engineer developing lithium-ion batteries. I tested materials in the lab and scaled them up for manufacturing. But certainly as more batteries enter the economy, we are going to have to come up with better means of recovering the precious things within those. And maybe downcycling them to other uses after their life as a vehicle battery. There are challenges there. I acknowledge that. But again, I think, yes.
Is there a footprint with that disposal, though, that we're not accounting for?
The end of life disposal for those batteries is included in the research I've seen, but there are various options for that. So certainly you could disassemble them and take the parts and recycle those parts. They could also be downcycled into maybe a larger battery pack to store energy from the grid. And so I think the end use, the downcycled use of those batteries would have to be taken into account there. And I think that's all still emerging. I don't have anything definitive to say on that.
Thank you.
Dan, did I hear you in there that, did you want to respond before we went on to Commissioner Murray?
No, I didn't have anything on that. I just wanted to pass to Aaron.
Okay, Commissioner Burney.
It's nice to meet you, Aaron. I can't see you. I don't know you. It's nice to meet you. You actually referred to a bio. I didn't get it. May I ask, how long have you been doing this kind of stuff? Hey, there's your picture.
Yeah, there I am. Hi. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if I should put in intro slides because maybe I've already heard it so many times.
Don't worry about it. How long have you been doing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I've been with Good Company almost 13 years, and my work at Good Company has focused on this accounting as well as climate action planning. Before that, like I said, I was an engineer doing lithium-ion batteries, and then when I moved to Oregon, I actually worked for a couple of years at Country Coach doing environmental compliance.
Oh, really? That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Thank you. You said that the first half or so of your slides were just boilerplate slides, correct? Giving us a feel for how this works.
Yeah.
And you said that methodology that you shared is 10 years old?
The local government operations protocol is about 10 years old, yes.
To identify what a local government's greenhouse gas emissions is, am I correct?
Yes, how to approach what to include the boundaries of that inventory. What's appropriate to look at for a local government, yes.
Would you guess if we did that 10 years ago, our carbon footprint would not be quite so large right now?
Oh, there's a lot of moving parts in there.
There are.
I would have to say yes, right? I mean, we've had growth in that time, but there's a lot of variables and factors that go into that. So I don't know that I could comment. Yeah.
Is it not true that if something is not measured, you don't focus attention on it?
Very true. That is very
Thank
true.
you very much. Okay. This about 14 or 15 months ago, I asked a question and no one at Lane County could answer it. And that question was, I wanted to get away from the debating that had been going on whether there is or is not climate change. And I simply asked, what is the carbon footprint of Lane County? can you tell me what the carbon footprint of Lane County is?
Of Lane County
government.
Lane
Yes.
County government operations.
Yes.
I would say it is represented by this graphic here.
So what
this
is
the profile of your emissions.
So can you give me the aggregate answer?
I don't have the aggregate number in my head right now. I am sorry. I mean, yeah, it's 35,000 tons or thereabout.
That's okay. I would love to see in the next presentation a simple answer to that question and a list of things that, based upon obviously years and years of expertise in the field, would be minimal cost items that we could get maximum gain from as you're continuing on your study. I'm just mentioning to Dan, to others, I don't know if that's possible, but I would love to see a list of tried and proven minimal cost items that while we're talking about it, we could implement and that would have an impact on emission. And then I want to just thank you. I think this is great and it's good information. And I really, really am interested in Dan, and you mentioned that as you look at this, the landfill emissions kind of tops the chart. And I'd love to see some modeling of, if we do X intervention at X cost, how that impacts that, and whether or not that really does decrease jobs. Oftentimes, I think that will increase jobs. It just changes what those jobs are. So anyway, I'm really enthused and interested. And unlike perhaps some, I'm also enthused and interested that Commissioner Bozovich is part of this. And the reason I say that is he's going to ask questions to, as I see it, to take critical looks, such as his question about the carbon emission impacts of lifestyle, getting rid of the parts of batteries. We've got to look at that, right? We've got to look at absolutely everything. So I'm delighted that we're moving in this direction. I'm delighted to be doing it with the people that we're doing it with. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments on this item? Commissioner?
Thank you, Chair Buckets. Just a quick comment on something that I talk about all the time, and that is trucking as where the solid waste and wastewater interface, and that is trucking the runoff from Short Mountain to Glenwood every single day. I estimate that since the Eugene City Council decided to not allow a pipeline from the Glenwood treatment plant or Glenwood plant to Short Mountain, we've put in about 2.8 million vehicle miles trucking the nasty stuff. That's a lot of miles. I'm not asking for calculations on that, but that's I would guess a huge footprint.
Any other questions or comments on this?
Chair, I would just like to note that the packet materials contain the more in-depth report that this presentation was based on, and that the board memo does have more analysis, and it contains that footprint question that Commissioner Burney was asking for. So our county
I apologize.
including all.
I apologize. I thought I read that, scoured it, so thank you.
That's right. So it would be 206,295 metric tons CO2 equivalent.
That sounds like a big number, but it would be nice to be able to, in the future, include two items. First is what we compare to maybe to other equivalent agencies, but also our opportunity costs for not moving forward on advancing, initiatives like a climate action plan that include ways in which to lower our greenhouse gas. Because as we debate things like EV vehicles versus combustion vehicles, there are opportunity costs either way in that we should be considering. And I know that this is ever evolving. This is really our first report. But those are things that I would be looking at as well. Commissioner Sorensen.
I just wanted to mention something and really agree with a request that Commissioner Burney made, and that is when we get to the next step, which is what are we going to do, start to do about this. I think having our consultant and our staff person and you, Mr. Hurley, all of you listing some of the short-term, I might say obvious things that other governments are doing or that is considered best practices that we can implement quickly. And I think this might also achieve some of our goals of the approach of being conservative and trying to use our resources carefully and making sure that we are getting the best bang for our buck. So I'm looking forward to the longer term, but I'm also looking for the short term wins along the way that we can pick up here as we go into what appears to be, and I say this now coming up to my period of being a short timer, that it appears that we're going to go into a really awful budgetary environment. If Oregon maintains its requirement that it has does not spend more than it gets, the state and all the governments, including the county government, not doing deficit spending during what looks like a pretty horrific economic times that we're already in, that we're going to get worse. We're going to really have to figure out how to be as efficient as possible. And I don't really know how we're going to do that. In the phone call, I think it was Friday, with the economic development people that AOC sponsored, they said it was a 90% reduction in economic development funding, namely the lottery, during 1 month. That is comparing March of 2019 to March of 2020. So where are we going to get the money to do any of these things? And I think it's just a matter of being as efficient as possible. So anyway, I'm looking forward to a list of things we can actually implement quickly. Thank you so much.
Commissioner Burney.
Can you hear me? I noticed on one of the charts you talk about supply chain and travel. It seems that during this pandemic, we've also been vulnerable to a global supply chain as it relates to getting PPE and other really needed items here locally. I would also be interested, as you guys kind of tackle this moving forward, if you have any recommendations as it relates, and it may even relate to economic development and a different way of looking at that, but that relate to how we might more localize the supply chain for needed items, so we're producing things we need here closer to home, and get off of some of these international supply chains, because I imagine that also will have carbon offset implications. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for the presentation. I appreciate it and look forward to the future presentations you have planned. And we'll move to County Council, item 8A, announcements.
Thank you, Chair Buck and Board of Commissioners. The first item that I wanted to bring up briefly, I think Commissioner or Chair Buck, I think we've resolved it. I know you had some correspondence with Ms. Lacey about the format of a litigation report and settlement cost update. What I'm going to recommend is that we have an exec session to discuss that before we discuss the general part of it in a public session. Obviously, we want to split those two things out. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention to make sure that you believe Ms. Lacey has answered all of your questions.
I had one suggestion back to her. But this is a follow-up really on we haven't had an update on where we are with litigation here for some time, and how we wanted to get that into the queue on the agenda for an exec session sometime soon, what would be included.
Okay, very good. And then the other thing, the next item is on my after announcements is a discussion on clarification on the redistricting assignment. I believe I sent the board yesterday. I had my staff go out and come up with, I think they did 10 of the most, taking the various ones that were mentioned by board members, summarize them, and then late yesterday afternoon, I got Mr. Bill Gary forwarded me a proposal from the Oregon League of Women Voters. He wanted to point out some concerns that he had before I forwarded it on to the board, which I did this morning. So really what I'd like to do, and I also I wanted to say that I did contact Ms. Betchar to get the dates for a November general election if the board decided to go with the charter amendment. Obviously, I think with the census being pushed back, that's not very practical now. I think we're looking at the soonest would be a May 2021 primary. And she has yet to get back to me with those dates, but I don't think that's that pressing. What I really like to do is have the board try and focus down a little bit so that we can sort of focus our resources on coming up with a specific proposal. One of the things I would point out is, for example, one of the big decision points is whether or not you want to have a charter amendment or an ordinance. And as I mentioned in my material, the difference between a charter amendment and an ordinance, charter amendment requires a vote of the people to change, an ordinance could be changed by a subsequent board. But I would point out one of the things I think is, since this would be a new process, one of the practical options is that you could decide upon a process, adopt it as an ordinance, go through this process once, because it seems to me almost inevitable there'll be changes in it, and then tweak it and fine tune it, and then present it to the voters, for example, as a charter amendment. It might be a little clunky to adopt something as a charter amendment and then find out as we go through the process that things don't quite work or need to be fixed. But I'm really just asking for hopefully the board to focus in on maybe one or two of these so that we can provide a more detailed analysis and come up with an actual proposal, if you will, not unlike what you see with the form that came with the from the League of Women Voters. It was just a lot to cover, and quite frankly, providing you all the pros and cons of virtually every one of those, or all the different ways that you could come up with a redistricting plan would literally result in hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of material, which I don't think the board wants to do. That's all I have, unless there's a specific question. I see Commissioner Sorensen has his hand up.
Thank you. I wanted to quickly state before we get into comments and questions that it is unfortunate that COVID has intervened in our census redistricting process for the year. On the bright side, this gives us a little additional time to think through exactly what we would want to do, especially given the fact that our staff are busy with other critical needs at the moment. So I'll move to Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the overview also from Mr. Dingle on this. It seems to me that one of the benefits of putting out the word to the community that we are interested in ideas, whether they're statutory, amendments to our code or charter amendments, is that way we can ask people, during the time that we're going to have because of the census issue, we're going to have additional time. And since staff is busy right now, I think if we made a more formal, invitation to people to make specific proposals, and just the general public, just if you have ideas, I mean, we're on track to implement the charter as it is now. And if people want to, make suggestions for changes, this is a good time to make them. And I don't mean make them like, hey, you guys should change the process, but I mean an actual proposal for a charter amendment or an actual proposal for a code amendment, and make the invitation. And if people think it's a big enough issue, they'll make the proposal. And it just seems to me that we're just not going to be able to take thousands of ideas from other states and counties and cities and state changes or not state changes and try to pull that all together to a proposal. I think we need to have somebody do it. And if the public is willing, if they think it's important enough, they'll make a suggestion and we can consider it. And that seems like a good way to, A, keep an open mind about this, but also realize that we have ongoing charter amendment duties that we're going to be, the board, I shouldn't say we, the board's going to be discharging between now and September of 2021. And the delay in the census, the delay in the ability of county government to just invent a new system without somebody proposing something. It seems to me we ought to just be open to proposals, and we ought to get it out and let the folks in the elections office that deal with people that are concerned about Lane County elections security, Lane County elections process, how we conduct elections, how we elect people, let them put the word out to their constituency. And that includes all the major political parties in Lane County and all the minor political parties, as well as organizations such as Common Cause and the Lane County League of Women Voters. Thanks.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. We don't have to look very far to see a successful redistricting that has happened right here. In 2001, the city of Eugene underwent a massive redistricting. A couple of the wards had grown by 5, or one by 6,000, one by 9,000 voters. So in the words of Jim Croteau at the time, there's going to be a significant change in this redistricting process. He also said we're recommending a more extensive citizen involvement process. At the time, Nancy Nathanson said, with regard to the process, I want to make sure we get public comment at the right time before it's too late. We took all of that into account in 2001 and made what was a major redistricting for the city of Eugene. Not exactly the county, but some of the protocol that went into that is really reapplicable for a county redistricting. Much of which we may have already done. But really significantly having people involved in it, keeping it as unpolitical as possible, is the best way to move forward with the redistricting process. And I believe that Nancy Nathanson said the right thing. Get public comment at the right time before it's too late. That was a quote. So I'm looking forward to the process. It's fun. When we 10 years later, I was back on the Eugene City Council. We redistricted again, but because we did the heavy lifting in 2001, the redistricting in 2011 was really quite minor. Very little line adjustments, although throughout the entire process, Ward 6, which was my ward, went from geographically about twice the size of the next size ward into now it is the 5th largest ward geographically in actual footprint. So things do need to happen because of a population shift, population growth. And bearing in mind that we took into account geographic separation, we also took into account man-made separation like highways and freeways. And it was a process that ultimately was very well received, and very little criticism came after the process. And a couple of people who are currently with the League of Women Voters were involved in the 2001 process. So we have lots of people here who have been part of a very successful redistricting process that I'm aware of. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Burney.
I would just like to say ditto to both Commissioner Farr and Commissioner Sorensen's remarks. I think the fact is that staff is already stressed. in this COVID-19 environment. And the fact is that that also relates to why the Census Bureau has pushed back timeframes. So I see us under I think it would be very imprudent to push on this at this point in time with staff. And this also gives us the time to develop a process that is everything that has been discussed. It's inclusive, it's transparent, people are invited to input, and it's balanced. And I think that that's our responsibility, and now we have time to do that. And I see nothing driving us to make any hasty decision other than to commit to that type of process at this moment. Thank you.
Any other comments? Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. So the Oregon League of Women Voters spent considerable time doing research on this process and trying to look for a better process that removes elected officials from picking their own voters, and that inherent conflict and a place where we can lose trust with our voters. Looking at the various concepts, and the one that the league came up with sort of matches the Colorado version that's in that report from the clerk, and the proposal that Mr. Gary passed on follows that, basically trying to retailor the statewide proposal that would have things like the Oregon Supreme Court appointing people to the commission, or appointing judges to appoint people to the commission, to utilizing retired Lane County judges. And I think that Mr. Dingell's email points out a couple things that may need to be changed in that to make sure that we don't develop a conflict between the branches of government, make sure we don't use any Schedule B judges in that pool that helps select the members of that commission. But I think what you see there is something that the league has spent a long time developing, and it's just been retailored to a county level. And a lot of the work's been done for us. And I think it provides a pretty balanced way of putting a citizens committee together. Without a charter amendment, though, what we run into is what our charter says, which basically says no less than every 10 years, the board will adopt new districts. So unless we change the charter, we're still going to pick our voters next year, because we did it 10 years ago. We have to do it next year. We can't wait till 2021 when we're doing our normal every 10-year minor adjustments. That's not going to work. We have to do this and we can't wait till past 2021. We have to do it in 2021 because it was last done in 2011. So it has to be completed next year by charter. So I don't believe there's really a whole lot of staff work into taking what Mr. Gary has passed on to Mr. Dingell from a group of citizens that took a long time to look at the statewide proposal by the League of Women Voters to make it county specific. And it would just be, I think, a fairly straightforward task if we were to move that one forward, unless you feel like the League of Women Voters is not done a good job in developing their statewide proposal. So for me, I'm willing to kind of move forward with Mr. Gary's submitted proposal, adjusting it for some of those legal and technical issues that Mr. Dingell brought up, and moving forward as quickly as we can with that as a charter amendment. Because until we amend the charter, even if we enact it by ordinance, whatever the committee decides, we can then change, because we're the final decision according to our charter. You have to amend the charter to take that power away from the commissioners.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. Well, for one thing, the charter already gives the board the authority to make the redistricting at this time because we have to do it at least once every 10 years. So if we did it this year, we would still be in compliance with the charter. The second thing I'd say is that, my proposal, which I just made, was if someone local wants to take an existing proposal that's out there and make it into a Lane County proposal, I'm open to hear it. But I don't think that's what's happened. I think what's happened is that Mr. Gary and his various clients have come to an agreement with the Oregon League of Women Voters to shop their proposal. So I don't think we have anything from the local league, and that's why I made the point of inviting people that have ideas and want to tailor them to the Lane County situation, where we're going to begin working on this redistricting either informally or formally later this year. And then formally, we will begin at some point, either later this year or beginning of next year, we're going to be appointing the committee that advises the Board of Commissioners unless there's a charter change. And I don't think that we should go beyond what our lawyer suggested, and that is make a charter proposal when we don't know if it's going to work or not legally. So we need to go slowly until we have some specific proposal.
Any other comments? I'll just make a few here. I concur that we haven't had significant public input in this process so far. We've talked about it cursory at our meetings, and we are now kind of seeing options available, but we haven't really had that process of going out into the public and discussing it with them, seeing what they like and what they don't like, especially in the midst of this pandemic. It doesn't seem like we've given that opportunity to people. And now that we have additional time from the census return, we have that opportunity to get public input and relieve our staff to do critical work during the pandemic while the public can get some information and think about it at home, but not pressure neither our staff or the public to get back to us within a certain amount of time when we don't necessarily have pressure on the back end now. That's kind of what I'm interpreting from several folks here on the board. Please let me know if that is not, that's not the main theme I'm hearing, because this could be a big change for our community. We should do it carefully and thoughtfully and with decent public input. Commissioner Bozovich, I see your hand up.
Thank you. So, I get the monthly League of Women Voters of Lane County newsletter, and this has been a long time topic of conversation in their newsletters and in their meetings, looking at redistricting process, as well as the statewide league. I believe, that the league is been engaged in this and engaging the public in this through their meetings. And, the kind of, yes, we haven't had public involvement because we haven't had a proposal to put in front of the public. It's pretty hard for the public to get involved unless we put something out there for them to actually react to. So I would be much more inclined to move forward with modifying this proposal that's a amendment of the statewide league's proposal and getting it out there for a public hearing and getting that comment. I don't, we've held a couple work sessions. There have been league folks in the audience, and we're not seeing any public comment on it really because we haven't put anything out there. Now, as soon as we scheduled an ordinance on the hotels, we've heard a lot about that. So it's, till we put something out there in the way of a proposal, and start holding some hearings. They don't have to be hearings necessarily towards adoption. Similar to we held hearings on the public safety measure back in 2013. We held 2 public hearings on that to gain input before we actually move towards adopting a ballot measure. I think we can hold public hearings on this, but we have to have something for the public to react to. Just kind of going, well, we need to get public input. We're going to be spinning our wheels, and 2021 is going to go by, and we're going to be adopting our own districts again.
Chair Buck, if I may.
Please.
I think our experience in putting together the materials that we generated for the board, there's a lot of truth in what Commissioner Bozovich is saying, is that when just taking some of the general ideas that the board had and then going out and finding those, it took a lot of work on our part. I think it would be good, and what I was going to suggest is, I think it does help to have people have something to look at that's in that format that they can comment on. And what I would suggest, recommend, or propose is that I post the version that we have by the League of Women Voters County Council website. Maybe Ms. Ashbridge does a press release and indicate that we are soliciting input and comments on that, and then people can send those directly to me at County Council's office, and I can try and synthesize them, and we could discuss an agenda team, maybe setting a work session or another place up there. But I can say it's very difficult when you hear, for example, just general concepts of we need someone neutral to make the decision and there should be a commissioner. I mean, it just is very generic. And I think when people see, here's what the proposal is, they can easily go, I like this, I don't like this, this should be changed. And I think that's what is that what you're talking about, Commissioner Bozovich? Give them something to people to tee off of?
Yes, I think so, because, we're generic discussions of trying to get a better system for redistricting lead to just, not going anywhere. Having a specific proposal, at least for people to go, I don't like that part of it, or this part makes sense. I think would be helpful to start our direction, our discussion in a direction. And the fact that the League of Women Voters has spent a number of years getting to this proposal, I think it's a good starting point. And I think, the local league is not necessarily in opposition to what the statewide league is doing, converse to what Commissioner Sorensen seemed to imply.
And what I could do is, in addition to that, is that we could, if the board would pick with head nods, maybe a couple of the other ones from that list, we could go out and actually get the actual format of them. And I'd be willing to post those on the website as well. So there would be two or three different versions for people to look at.
I'm really interested in the process that Commissioner Farr said was done for the city of Eugene in this. I think the idea of actually having something for people to comment on makes sense, but at the same time, there's a process question that we have on the table as well. How is that going to roll out to the public, and how was it done then successfully? And what did that model look like? So if we know it was successful, if that's something that we want to incorporate in this process. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. Yeah, I just think in terms of trying to synthesize the different perspectives here, I guess I would take the view that, it is meaningful to have public involvement and public comment on a proposal. And my idea is, as I mentioned, is to invite the public to make proposals that are specific to Lane County. And if the League of Women Voters proposal, the Common Cause proposal, and other proposals can be altered quickly by the advocates for those to be sent in to us, then we aren't putting up what the state of Oregon is going to do or thinking of doing. We're not putting up what other communities are doing. We're putting up what proposals we've received from Lane County residents. And so I don't really see a big difference in the approach other than to have it, first and foremost, that we invite people to make proposals. And we might have proposals that say, keep it the way you have had it and improve the process, such as the process that Commissioner Farr was mentioning. The City Council did ultimately adopt the awards that the advisory group put together and did it because of the extensive public involvement process. So to me, I would just like to be really clear that we're inviting everybody, not just the League of Women Voters of Lane County, not just Common Cause of Lane County, but anybody in Lane County to make proposals. Then we'll sort them out. We'll decide which ones we really want public comment on, and then it'll be a real thing. And I think that nothing I've said really conflicts at all with what Commissioner Bozovich said, other than maybe I want to have it specific to Lane County and I want to have it proposed by someone in Lane County. And that can be done fairly quickly by those that are hot to make the change. And for those that don't want to make the change, they can make suggestions on how the process should be changed, even if they want the board to be the main decision maker at the end. So that's how I would kind of try to harmonize this whole discussion.
Commissioner Bernie.
Don't strain your eyes, harmonize. Sorry. I don't feel that this is nor needs to be contentious in any way. I think that we have an objective, which is inclusivity, transparency, and balance. I think we need to define a process, and it sounds like that ought to be informed by what Commissioner Farr identified as one that worked. And really, we have a time frame. And my only point was, let's push it back a little bit while staff's overwhelmed, and let's lay all this out. That's all. And it can be reverse engineered so that everything we are trying to achieve and every decision that needs to be made can be made in time.
Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. First, I want to say that Bill Gary and the folks that put that proposal together are Lane County residents, and it's a Lane County proposal. Second, what we're talking about is a proposal for a public process, not the actual process of doing the redistricting right now. What Pat keeps referring back to was something that the city put together to do their public involvement for developing the districts. What I'm talking about is having a proposal that will outline and we can discuss. That's, until we put a proposal out there, discuss the actual process for gaining citizen input. I mean, that particular proposal, following that Colorado and the state league's proposal, brings together a citizen committee that holds public hearings to get that public input into the redistricting process. And until we put a proposal out there for people to react to see if that's a fair process, I'm not talking about proposing the actual process set today. I want to put something out there to have people react to see if they think it's a fair public process to gain citizen input. And that's how we get input on that process. Ultimately, though, if we're not reaching towards changing the charter, we'll do what the city of Eugene did 10 years ago, which was their city councilors voted to adopt their own districts. And ultimately, that's the problem with our current system. No matter how much public input you do, they could have rejected the citizen committee process and chosen to draw them themselves, because they still had the power inside the city charter to do that. And no matter how much public process we put together for this next process, if we don't change the charter where we have the final say, which happened in the last several redistricting meetings where the commissioners decided to pull their own versions and were approved by 3-2 votes the last several times, that's where we'll be. You know, we'll be at where we are going to decide who our voters are. And so if we don't have something to start putting out there to get public reaction to whether that's a satisfactorily good way to get public input, is neutral, and will keep the commissioners from playing games with the districts, unless we start that, we'll never get there. And having something well drawn out that has had a lot of thought put into it by the League of Women Voters, adopted towards Lane County, I think is a good place to start on the drawing board.
I just want to clarify, when I said process, we have a process question. The process question is how we're going to go through either a charter amendment or an ordinance. Just want to clarify that. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Back in 2001, ultimately, after all of the public process, the City of Eugene, the part-time Eugene City Council did all the work and made the changes itself. It could have been contentious because one city councilor actually districted himself out of his district, but it was done in a very judicious fashion. And Kelly Osborne and Linda Lynch were a part of that process. They were on the staff of the City of Eugene at the time. They should have great input. They're currently both with the League of Women Voters in Eugene. So, we have resources available to us and to staff to help us, to guide us through the process, Chair Buck. I think, we don't have to sweat it. And Commissioner Burney, you're right. It doesn't have to be contentious. This can be a very judicious and cut and dried process that ultimately has no argument. Over and over again, we hear the term, "This is my district because of gerrymandering," and I don't know how many times I've heard gerrymandering since I became a county commissioner. And the biggest change was that Ferry Street Bridge came to Eugene from Springfield, and Glenwood went to Springfield from Eugene. Other than that, it was kind of a street by street issue, and really. I believe we can, once again, Commissioner Burney, come up with a process that's not very contentious at all.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, my concern is that we have not had any process to ask anybody if they think that proposals should be submitted. And I have no problem with evaluating the current proposal, but I'd like to make sure that we have other proposals and the opportunity for other people to make proposals before we say, oh, by the way, we have this one proposal and we want to hear your views on it. I think we should have other proposals and hear from other people and then ask the public, okay, we've got these proposals. Do you think we should move forward on these or not? And that way it's a little bit fairer. Just to say, that we have one proposal and that's the one proposal we really like, so we really want your views on it, seems to me is not really true, number one. And number two, it isn't fair to the people who up until this moment didn't realize the Board of Commissioners was going to make a request for public comment on the Lane County Legal Counsel's website, a request for public comment on a proposal that was sent out to us yesterday. So to me, that's all I'm asking for is the fairness of putting out a press release saying the Board of Commissioners is interested in your views on what type of redistricting, if any, we undertake and any changes, if any, and then we will have at least one proposal, but we may have others. And I think that seems like a element of fairness.
I think at this point, staff is looking for some kind of direction from us. I see, or I should say I hear, kind of two different directions from us. One is the one in which Commissioner Sorensen mentioned, is to do kind of a call to action to our community saying we're talking about redistricting. We're interested in what you have to say and submit some ideas. And the other one that I'm hearing is to submit to the public the one that we have and entice feedback on it. So I think we need to get to a point here in our discussion here fairly soon in order to give staff some direction. Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. I would be fine with a modified version of what Commissioner Sorens is putting forward. I just want to make sure that we don't delay this continuing action, because we've basically got until July to really start moving the clock forward if we're going to put forward a charter amendment in time to have it be effective for next year's redistricting. I'm happy with moving forward with some kind of public input session, whether it's a hearing or however we do it, where we ask for public proposals on changing the redistricting process. At the same time, I don't think it hurts us to put this one out there as one that we might be considering, because it at least gives people an idea of what might be. Right now, we've been so generic about talking about this, it's difficult for people to react. That's all I'm trying to put forward. I just want to get to the next step of starting to get to a decision, which means we need to have some kind of public session where we take public input on this and let the public know that we are considering making a change in the redistricting process and possibly wrapping it into our charter. That's all I really want to get to. That's what, I wanted to have something for people to throw darts at, but if you want to have multiple things for people to throw darts at, that's fine with me. I just want to move forward with the people throwing darts. And it doesn't have to be contentious.
Mr. Bernie.
Yes, but I just want everyone to know that I want some of the darts. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. I appreciate the fact that it's just, it's just common sense. If you ask people for input and it's in a void, that's not going to provide the kind of targeted input you need to make a good decision. One, which I think was your point, Commissioner. Two, it's also, I think I would actually not want whatever website people went to be the county council's website. I really think it ought to be the county administrator or some function of Lane County government that's not, the council will obviously be watching it and looking at it and guiding us in terms of what we do so that we are within the law. So that's another point. A third point is, however we present this, whether the League of Women Voters proposal is a part of soliciting additional proposals or not, if it is, it needs to be messaged in such a way that we are not leaning towards this. This is not our only example, et cetera. It just needs to be messaged in the right way. And finally, I would like to say that oftentimes in a democracy, minority opinion is the most important opinion. And I'm not talking about ethnic minority necessarily. I'm talking about people who right now don't even know we're having this conversation. People who are part of groups that probably would like to have an interest in input. And I think we have time to do that. And I guess those are my points. And now I'll end it with a question. And that question is, as a result of the delays, which means the U.S. Census Bureau will not be delivering to the president data, and out of the White House, data will not be delivered to state legislators until July 1st, 2021. Do we not have the opportunity to push anything if something went to the ballot until the May primary, or no?
It's my understanding that the May primary is most likely the best new target if we want to put something out to the public. Mr. Dingell might have a different view, but that's my understanding at the time. I think he's getting those dates for us. So this gives us a timeline, a new timeline that we didn't have before. We were getting a little pressed prior, but now this gives us a timeline in order to get public input and be able to put something out there prior to getting the census back in July of 2021. It sounds like we're getting to a consensus that we would like to see the public input as the next step, or how to, I would kind of like to see an outline of what the process would be from public input to sifting through ideas to ultimate consideration of some of the top ideas throughout like the remaining of 2020, so that we can get to a point where we can put something out early 2021 in order to garner official public hearing feedback, and whether it's going to be an ordinance or a charter change. That's my preference. Is there any objection to that? I think that would satisfy getting public input and getting something done timely for the next census. Right, Mr. Dingle, does that give enough direction for now?
I think so.
Clear as mud.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, with that, we do need to move on to our Board of Public Health meeting. So I'm going to recess the Lane County Board of Commissioners meeting, and we will open the joint meeting Board of Health and Board of Commissioners. Yes, Commissioner Bozovich.
So I need to jump back a second. I was just flipping through the charter real quick to confirm this, but I believe, and Steve can confirm this, Dingle can confirm this also, I believe charter amendments have to be voted on in even years. In a May or
That's
November.
correct. Correct.
So November is our target period. Just so you guys know, that's our deadline process-wise.
Right, for a charter amendment, and then the board would also have the ability to just adopt an ordinance or refer an ordinance, and that could be done in any election.
But an ordinance will not change our power to change the districts post any sort of public process. Only a charter amendment can.
That's correct. The board can change an ordinance at any time.
All right, let's move on to the Board of Public Health. Are there any adjustments to the agenda? Hearing none, are there any emergency business? Not hearing none, or not hearing any. We'll go to item number 3, County Council. Item A, first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-03. Mr. Dingle and I believe Ms. Gaffney from Health and Human Services are with us.
That's correct. Chair.
Yes. So Steve, would you like me to start, or do you want to start this?
Why don't you go ahead, Ms. Gaffney, and explain the sort of the background, and then I can take, I believe the ordinance itself is pretty self-explanatory, but I will address some of the concerns that were raised by the board when I picked up this assignment.
Thank you. Chair Bucking, Commissioners, and I know today is just the first reading and request to set a second reading and public hearing. And traditionally, we do a more extensive staff presentation at the second reading and public hearing. So I will keep my comments today brief in anticipation that we can have a more thorough discussion at a second reading. You'll recall that this came up at a board meeting a couple weeks ago when we were describing an ongoing challenge the Emergency Operations Center has had in soliciting soliciting cooperation from hotels and motels to be able to provide a limited number of rooms for us to be able to house people who needed to be isolated and were not able to do that at home. And we talked at that time about really our strong and deep desire was to have a cooperative relationship with our vendors in the community to be able to provide that service, and that we would suggest proceeding with the ordinance process in the event that we were not able to achieve that in the intervening time. So I did want to at least give you an update on where we are in the community right now. And that is that we've had great offers of help from Travel Lane County and from the Oregon Lodging and Restaurant Association to really help us be able to bridge relationships with vendors in the community. And I want to appreciate both of those organizations for helping us do outreach. And we also have had our internal contracting and procurement staff inside of the Emergency Operations Center calling through hotels, both small private lodging establishments as well as chains in the county to try to broker an agreement that we could lease 5 rooms. We don't, as you know from our case count, we don't need whole hotels, and really it would not make financial sense for us to lease an entire hotel, but instead to have 5 rooms set aside. Last week, we did have success with a couple hotels in rural Lane County, which is really fantastic. And at this point, we have those hotels on standby in the event that we need those rooms in our rural communities. We have not been able to get agreement with a single hotel in the Eugene Springfield area to be willing to rent rooms to public health for that purpose. And I will tell you, we also continue to hear concerns from Peace Health Hospital that they are having the same struggles with hotels. I think there are a couple different issues at play. Certainly there are some hotels that are completely closed during this time, and it makes sense that they would not be able to rent us a small number of rooms. I also think that there is rumor and probably some fear that is not based in science about what it would mean to be willing to accept a voucher from public health. I will remind the board that this is a standard public health practice. We work with hotels to lodge people who have TB, who have other diseases where they need to be isolated, and we've had success with that over the years. But there is a certain amount of fear that has come about specifically related to COVID. I want to assure you that in approaching the hotels, we've been clear that that public health will pay an outside cleaning vendor to come in and do CDC recommended deep clean of the room afterwards, that we would absolutely guarantee to cover any damages. We understand there may be some premium price associated with our renting. So I feel like we've made a good faith effort to acknowledge the challenges with the vendors themselves. As I said, I think there are some rumors. For instance, I know there's one rumor that we have placed someone who was COVID positive in a hotel and they exposed other people in the hotel. And frankly, that's just not true. But sometimes stories get their own life out there. I do think as we move forward, and I know there is not a decision whether to adopt it today or not, so we still have some work to do moving forward. What I believe is our next step on the staff side is really to continue to engage in conversations with some of our local hotels who would be in a position to accept our vouchers and talk with them some about what our policies and practices really are, help work through some of the rumors and fears to try and help people be more comfortable with this moving forward. So I would ask that you move to schedule a second reading, and as part of that, I would commit that we absolutely will continue those conversations in the interim. So maybe I'll stop there, and Mr. Dingle, if you wanted to add anything.
Thank you, Ms. Gaffney. Yes, I'll just be very brief. I drafted this and I went back and listened to the board discussion on this, so I tried to address all of the concerns. So number one, it has an emergency clause, which means, you know, it takes effect immediately. I believe as Commissioner Bozovich wanted it clear that the county would be responsible for any damages to the property that it was caused by folks that we placed there. And it was very clear that everyone wanted a sunset clause so that this would end. I picked sort of December 31st as it expired. I will say that, you know, one of the other things that has come up, in addition to the responsibility for damages, is I've seen some of the materials that have been submitted by folks who've expressed an interest in this, and there would be potentially some liability for the county in terms of not just property damage, but perhaps injuries to other people. At least they're based on this ordinance. And the only reason I say that is, remember, this is not voluntary. So if this passes, putting those people there, we would be doing that involuntarily. So that would make us responsible for whatever happens. Quite frankly, the damages part, I think, wasn't necessary, but I gathered from the comment from at least Commissioner Bozovich and maybe someone else that they wanted it explicit and clear in the ordinance that the county would be responsible for the damages. So that's all I have, unless you have a specific question. That's all I have, unless you have a specific question.
Any questions, Commissioner Fox?
Thank you. Just first, a comment that maybe there could be a response to. When we talk about irrational fears and non-scientific concerns, in many cases, we're talking about people who are working for the hotels, who maybe this is the only job that they could get. Maybe they are being paid close to minimum wage, and maybe their fears, well, while they may be described as irrational or unscientific, are very real and very much a part of the way they would operate with their family. The fear is that they would be exposed. And that's something that, as we move forward with the ordinance, we have to respond to the public comment regarding that. So, and Ms. Gaffney, I understand the scientific nature of it, and I understand the guarantee that we'll clean the rooms, but how do we guarantee that people working in the hotel, how can we guarantee that the people working in the hotels have a level of safety that they can carry home to their family? Just a question, and no need for an answer to that right now. The other, Mr. Mokrahayski and Ms. Gaffney, is for you. If a facility were to come forward and offer us the entire facility in lieu of scattered site rooms, which would be proposing through the ordinance, potentially proposing through the ordinance, if it was a closed facility that potentially we could operate in its entirety for the entire emergency period, however long that may be, is that something we would consider? It would be that would, you know, take into account that no hotel staff would be involved, but it would be a facility that would be ours to use, X number of rooms for however long we need to use it. Is that something we could consider?
Chair Buck and Commissioner Farr, I appreciate that question, because I know there have been some hotels that have suggested that we could rent the entire hotel.
I'm sorry, Ms. Gaffney, for the interruption. If it were free of charge to us, not rent, but actually operate the facility with no charge to the county other than staffing.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I guess I was equating and maybe I don't understand your question. You're saying that we would pay for the hotel staff?
We would contract with staff to run it. For instance, a nonprofit. I don't know this. You guys are the experts in how to handle it. But if we had a facility that was empty, that was ours to use, with no hotel staff in place, that we would staff it using either Lane County or nonprofit contracting staff. and there would be no charge for the facility. And I'm not saying, I may have heard rumblings about such a facility, but if that were the case, if we could do that, is that something we would consider instead of imposing our will on the whatever that will may be on independent scattered hotel operators?
Thank you for the clarification, Commissioner Farr. I think that ultimately that design is absolutely what we're trying to achieve, and that's the purchase of 100 River Avenue, is that that facility will enable us to have an empty facility that we are in control of, and we would need to pay for the staff to operate that. So I do think that's our design, and so the hotels really are an interim step. And again, this is something that public health departments across the state are working to have in place, because it's typically part of our toolkit of how we're able to isolate individuals. I think the hesitation for moving forward with a hotel and a complete hotel the last several weeks is one based on cost. It's just expensive to be able to do that. But ultimately, I think that is our plan once River Avenue is open and staffed, then really hotels are less of an issue for us.
I've not made my question very clear. I'll continue it off camera sometime. Thank you.
Very good. Commissioner Burney.
Commissioner Farr, I invite you to tell me to stop at any moment, but I didn't hear your question answered, so I would like to pursue it. I'm going to get to that. So, Karen, my understanding is you came to the Board of Commissioners with this issue because you were not voluntarily receiving cooperation for rooms from hotels. Is that correct?
Chair Buck and Commissioner Burney, yes, that is correct.
Okay, so, and as I recollect our discussion, no commissioners wanted or relished or would have otherwise chose to impose our will on private businesses, in this case, hotels, except we're trying to respond to the medical needs of a fragile population. Is that correct?
Yes, Commissioner Burney, absolutely.
And normally, you have not had this issue, but it's standard protocol for you to be able to rent rooms at market prices, and it has not been an issue up until this point. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. It would seem to me that since we're not, having read the emails and heard the testimony of representatives of the hotel industry, and knowing that this is something that we would do reluctantly, and knowing that we don't even have the option of making a binding decision at this point in time, it seems to me that this is the opportunity for the industry to work with you to develop a solution that does not require the Board of Commissioners to give you this stick. Would you agree with that?
Commissioner Burney, I could not have said it better myself. I would prefer not to go this route as well.
Perfect. That's the end of so we now have an opportunity to create a solution without government telling business, you have to do this or that. I think that's wonderful. That's the challenge. Now, secondarily, and again, Commissioner Farr, tell me if I don't articulate this properly. If there were a hotel that would not charge us any room charge whatsoever, but simply let us use and take over their facility for a finite period of time, would that solve the problem?
Without looking at the fine print, I would say that's a very promising solution. If there was access at no cost, since we would pay to clean it anyway with a private contractor, yes.
Thank you very much.
I have a question about this. Is it required, is this having this system in place where you can rent a hotel when you need it for this purpose part of the requirement to get to phase 1 of the governor's reopening of the economy? Because I know there's a lot of things, a laundry list of things that we have to have in place in order to do so, but I'm unsure if this is one of those.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Clearly, the governor's list is an evolving document. As I read it at this point, one of the gateways is to really show that we have done a good job of controlling the spread of disease. And so to that extent, this is one tool in our toolbox. I have not seen specifically a checklist that says you have to have contracts with hotels, but it does in fact require that the community has done a good job of containing the spread of disease, and we can demonstrate that.
So a little muddy. Commissioner Bosevich.
Thank you. So I'm having a little bit of heartburn about this whole thing, and it's the libertarian side of me that doesn't like government coercion that's having a problem with it. You know, as we first walked into this pandemic with a lot of unknowns, it seemed like there was a need for some of these emergency actions, but as we've gone on in time and we're seeing some of the results of, like we spoke earlier today, of those testing of the population, seeing more widespread exposure in the population than we first thought, and the fact that we've only got really one hospitalization going on here in Lane County, it makes me not want to use the force of government to force the private sector to enter into a contract with government. And I think Commissioner Burney sort of stated that in one way. And I think moving to a second reading and public hearing leaves that coercion on the table. And I'm not comfortable with that. I will be voting no on this first reading, hoping that we don't go to a second reading and that we can work this out in cooperation with private folks and get to where we need to go without having that stick hanging over their head. We can always come back later, but I really kind of have a problem with negotiating with a hammer hanging over somebody's head. You know, agree to a contract for us to get these rooms, or the board will vote yes in 2 weeks. And we scheduled that vote already, by the way. That doesn't sound like a free and uncoerced contract. So, you know, I have a little bit of problem. And I also kind of wonder, I'm seeing a real push for this next version of federal bailout to include hospitals because their lack of business because of not doing elective procedures or non-mandatory. Is there not rooms available in the hospitals to isolate some of these people? And also kind of wondering, you know, as we talk about hospitality industry and their workers, we're also talking about an industry that is heavily populated with Hispanics that's already taking the brunt of this in Oregon as far as a disproportionate cases of COVID-19. So, you know, for all those reasons, I'm just not comfortable moving forward with this and would really like to see the board kind of pull back and let's have a free and open negotiation with the private sector rather than moving towards trampling additional constitutional rights in the name of a crisis that we're continuing to see happen, from things like limiting people with motorboats in Michigan versus sailboats to you know allowing people to go to a farmer's market, but not do other public activities. Our choices seem to be starting to get to be random and unjustifiable, and moving forward with coercion in this case, I think, is unjustifiable.
Commissioner Burney.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think Commissioner Bozevich and I are on the same side, but I think in terms of objectives, I think our strategies are different. I will be voting yes on this to move it forward, not necessarily with the intent of approving it when it comes to us again, but with the intent of providing an incentive for the parties to work it out. That's all.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. I have two things. First is I'd like to make a motion to approve the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing on ordinance 20-03 for May 5, 2020 at 10 a.m.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. There's a motion on the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. And secondly, I totally agree that if we could come to an agreement with someone like was described by Commissioner Farr, where an entire hotel, if we needed something that big, then we ought to pursue that. I like that idea. Seems like it would put people to work in terms of a nonprofit. It would simplify the cleaning concerns and the concerns of hotel employees. And I hope we don't need to do this. I hope we don't need to pass this ordinance. But it seems to me that we don't know what the number of cases really is, because we don't have really much testing, and we just need to be ready for this when if it occurs. And I hope by the time we get to the meeting 2 weeks from now, I hope that we can come to an agreement with somebody. If not, then I think we have to move this. I think that one of the drawbacks of not moving forward with this is, as it stands now, my understanding is that staff has already attempted to make agreement with people, and it has kind of fallen through. And so, although I don't like the idea of coercing someone to do something they don't want to do, I'm willing to do that if staff believes that is really the only option to protect public health. I'm interested in protecting the public health, not only of the people that have the disease, but also the public health of the people that don't have the disease. And so I just find myself in a conundrum. I don't really like the idea of compelling business to do something they don't want to do. On the other hand, we have a specific public health need that staff's identified. If staff comes back in 2 weeks and says, or even 1 week and says, no, we don't need this, I'm more than willing to move to get rid of this public hearing and not even have it. But it just is a sort of plenary matter. Do we, as the local public health, assert ourselves and say, we don't know if it's going to spike. We don't know if this need is going to be there or not. We think it might be. We are planning. Hopefully it won't occur. But we have to be ready, and we have to be ready quickly. And I think that this seems like a prudent thing to do at this time. And if we don't need it, I hope staff will send us an email and that the agenda team will pull it off next week. Set it for next week to pull the public hearing off. Thank you.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair. To the motion, I am going to support the motion in no small part because of the latter words that Commissioner Sorensen just said. If we need to pull the public hearing, pull the second reading, we can if we have an alternative that steps forward that is that's going to replace the need for what Commissioner Sorensen called coercion. The pandemic is still mysterious to us, how long it's going to last, how many people are going to be affected. And we are all here on the Board of Health, we're all interested in saving lives. That's what it's all about. And taking extraordinary measures to save lives if extraordinary measures are what it takes. That being said, we would like to keep things in the realm of ordinary as opposed to extraordinary. Normal course of business as much as possible. And I believe that by passing this ordinance, the first reading and moving it forward, it gives us an opportunity to engage in a public discussion about what are the alternatives to this fairly draconian ordinance, as it would be, compelling people to give up their property for government use. I agree with moving the ordinance forward, and I look forward to what will be a fairly robust public discussion in the next few hours and days. Thank you.
Commissioner Burney.
Earlier today, I discussed why I felt restaurants should stay open and how they should stay open. And the hotel and restaurant industry are often interlocked. So I simply want to say that I am looking forward to voting to move this forward. And I am very much looking forward to pulling it from a future agenda, because the industry has chosen not to have government tell them how they need to do something, but has chosen to step up, work with staff, and determine what in their interests makes sense in the event this becomes necessary. And I also am delighted to hear, Karen, that if there were a hotel that would loan us their facility to operate temporarily, that might provide a solution. Thank you very much. Oh, and I would also be very interested, if this public hearing does occur, in what Commissioner Bozovich requested, which is assessing if there are open rooms in hospitals, because you got to admit that makes a lot of sense. So that assessment should be part of anything staff provides us if we have to take action, which we all hope we do not. Thank you.
Very good. So we have a motion on the floor, which is approving the first reading and setting the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 20-03 in the matter of amending Lane County Chapter 9. Lane County lodgers must accept government vouchers or payments during an emergency. Violators are subject to penalties. Sunset clause declaring an emergency. Is there any further discussion? Oh, let me make sure I said motion by Commissioner Sorensen and seconded. Remind me who seconded. It was Commissioner Farr.
Burney.
Commissioner Burney seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
All right, motion passes 4-1 with Commissioner Bonizovich in the nay. There's nothing more on our agenda for our joint meeting of the Board of Health and Board of County Commissioners. And we are in recess on the regular Board of Commissioners, but we will be back at 1:30, which is a new link to get onto the meeting. With that, we are adjourned of the Board of Health.